Hi everyone, and welcome to Finish Your Plate. Today we're going to be talking about rye bread. Rye bread is probably the single most sought after item for any Finnish expat. And the rye bread in Finland is certainly very different from all the other breads that you might be able to find in the US and elsewhere in the world. For one, it has almost exclusively rye in it. It does not usually contain any wheat, except sometimes the factory made products, bakery made products, they might actually contain some wheat because they say it's easier to bake with wheat. And that's kind of interesting too, because if you read some bread books, sometimes you even see it mentioned in the bread book that you have to add wheat to rye bread. You cannot make rye bread without any wheat, or you cannot make bread with rye alone. And I'm going to show you that is simply not true. And also, if you are Finnish, if you're looking for that rye bread, or if you just want to make Finnish rye bread, this recipe is so simple, you're going to be able to make it at home too. So let's take a look at the ingredients first of all. I've found out that the King Arthur flour, pumpernickel flour, really works great for rye bread. This is not sponsored by King Arthur flour, but I've tried several different brands of rye flour available in the US, and it's not always that easy to find rye flour in the stores in the US. So this is great because you can order it online and it gives you really great results. It's going to be exactly the kind of rye bread that you're looking for. The second thing is the sourdough starter. Now, I ordered mine online, but I just got one of the free ones. There are free ones that you can get online. You do not have to pay for your sourdough starter. This one works very well. So the thing when making bread, any sourdough baker will tell you that one of the key qualities of sourdough bread is the bread hydration. So that is basically the ratio of flour to water. The rye bread that I'm going to show you, it's going to be very, very high hydration. It's going to be 100% hydration. But the trick is also that makes the recipe so simple to follow. What 100% hydration means is that you're going to use equal amounts of water and flour. Now, if you're going to use the whole bag of rye flour like this, just save maybe half a cup or so just for dusting afterwards. But other than that, it is really as simple as it gets. So I have 6 deciliters of water, filtered water, but it does not necessarily have to be warm water because we're going to ferment this in a warm place for several hours. So it'll get a chance to warm up. Don't use ice cold water, just tap water is fine. So since I have 6 deciliters of water, I know that I'm going to need 600 grams of flour. So I'm just going to measure 600 grams of flour. So the other critical component is, of course, salt. So I'm going to be making bread that has 2% salt, which is fairly standard. Now, the 2% is 2% of the dry ingredients that we're using. So since I have 600 grams of flour here, that means that I need to measure 12 grams of salt. So now pretty much all my ingredients are ready here. The one thing that I will need is a mold for the bread. So since the bread is so high hydration, what it tends to do is it tends to spread out. we're going to see that it's actually going to be more like batter consistency than actual dough consistency. When baking breads like that, a mold helps a lot. So that will stop the bread from spreading out, and instead it will rise up. Now, if you don't have a mold like this one is a silicone mold made for making hamburger buns. But if you do not have a mold, you could certainly use a baking sheet, in which case I would recommend just reducing the hydration just a little bit, going with maybe 97, 98% hydration. So that will prevent the bread from spreading out more than rising up. But I'm going to be using this mold for my bread. The other thing is the sourdough culture. Now, let's face it, having a sourdough culture is kind of like having a pet. You have to take it out, you have to feed it, and unfortunately, sometimes they also die. Could you make rye bread without the sourdough culture? I'm going to say that yes, you could. It's not going to be as good as the ones in Finland. It's not going to certainly have that tangy sourdough taste. But if you're in a pinch, you do not want to have a sourdough culture lying around, or you do not have one. You could add commercial yeast into this, let it ferment in the fridge instead of a warm place. Let it ferment for 2 days and then bake it. But since I have the sourdough culture, I'm just going to use that instead, which is definitely going to produce superior results. So now all I'm going to do, I'm just going to combine the ingredients. So the sourdough culture that I'm using, I've fed it with equal amounts of water and flour. So it basically has the same hydration as my finished dough. So that's why it's not going to affect the hydration one way or another if you use more, if you use less. I'm going to put about 100 grams of my starter into the dough. And now all I'm going to do, I'm just going to mix it with my wooden spoon. And there you go. Like I said, it's more like a batter consistency, and it's even going to get a little bit more loose as it ferments. I'm going to leave this at room temperature for about 8 hours overnight, and then I'm going to be baking it in the molds. So I will see you in about 8 hours. The dough has been proofing now for about 8 hours, and the consistency has changed more like, I would say, almost like chocolate mousse kind of consistency. So what I'm going to do is, I have these bread molds, so I'm going to scoop it from here into the bread molds. And what I'm going to use is, I'm going to use some of these automatic ice cream scoops that I have. These ice cream scoops, they come in various sizes. There's a small one like this, and then going through a couple middle sizes, and then a large one. So it really depends on what size breads you want to make, what size scoops you want to use. But I'm probably going to use the second to smallest one and put 2 scoops in it. Again, if you're not using a bread mold, and let's say you're just using a sheet pan like this, you could put in a piece of parchment paper on the bottom, dust it with some rye flour, and then when you scoop your batter in, when you scoop your dough in, try to put the dough one ball on top of the other. That way you can get very round breads. If you put them a little side by side, the bread is going to come out a little oblong, which may be something that you want, just a little tip. So I'm just going to dust these with a little bit of flour. Not that it needs much, because actually this mold that I have, this is made from like silicone mesh. This is great for things not sticking to it. So now I'm going to take the scoop and then just scoop and here we can really see almost the mousse-like consistency of the dough. With these molds, I'm not too worried about putting the balls on top of one another because there's no space for them to grow sideways. It's all going to go up. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wet my fingers and then just even out the dough into the pan. So with very wet fingers, I'm just going to even out. You could use also some sort of a press if you have something that's exactly the size of the mold. I don't happen to have one. Once you see your fingers starting to stick, that's a sign that you need to wet your hands again. Now I'm just going to sprinkle these again with some flour. So the flour on top actually prevents the dough from drying out. I'm going to let these rest for about 20 minutes or so while my oven is heating up. And then after about 20 minutes, I'm going to put these in the oven. The oven is at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Also, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a cast iron pan in the oven on the bottom while the oven is heating up. So this way, when the oven is warm, the pan is also hot. And when I put these breads in the oven, I'm going to pour water into the hot pan. That's going to create steam, and that's going to create a nice crust for the bread. Okay, so now my oven is heating up. I'm going to put the cast iron pan in, and I'm going to let these rest for about 20 minutes. So the oven is hot. I have a hot pan in there. I'm just going to pour some water in it. And one last thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to use this dough docker. So I'm just going to dock these breads very quickly. And what that's going to do is it's going to prevent that cracking on top of the bread as it rises in the oven. So these are going to bake for a fairly long time. It's about 15 minutes, could be even 20 minutes at 450 degrees. Just keep an eye on it. They can be fairly dark when they come out of the oven, but like I've said before, rye bread really likes a good toast, so don't be afraid baking them a little bit longer than you would wheat bread, for example. Okay, so this is going to go in the oven, 450 degrees, about 15-20 minutes. So the bread has been cooling down for a few hours. I've covered it with this towel. Now you have to remember, resist the temptation to cut into the bread right as it's out of the oven because the crumb is still developing at that point. If you cut into the bread while it's still warm, you may find out that the texture is actually a little bit gummy. It almost feels like it's still raw in the center, but it's not. And the texture will improve over the next couple hours. If you prefer a little bit more harder crust, then let them sit uncovered. But if you like a little bit softer crust, cover them while they're sitting. And then what you get is that's what the crust develops into after a few hours. So let's just make a quick sandwich. And here we go, just a little bit of butter, maybe some cheese. It's all you need on freshly baked bread. Maybe a little bit of salmon soup on the side. This has been Finish Your Bread. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Finish Your Plate.